Hi everyone, it's time to take a look at soil and how we get that. And we do that through weathering. So we have to break down our parent material like a granite or a quartz or whatever the rock happens to be. But remember just the basics, weathering is the breaking down of rocks and other materials on the Earth's surface. So we have our mechanical weathering. Remember, release of pressure, freeze thawing, plant growth, abrasion, animal action. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through this because that was a whole different set of notes. And we've got our chemical weathering where we have carbonation and hydration and oxidation. So in other words, rust and leaching of minerals through the soil. And organisms, remember, this is a big deal because lichens and mosses are the first stages of soil development because they start to secrete an acid, remember, and that slowly wears down the rock. And that leaves a little bit of material. And as that builds up, and then maybe some leaves or something fall on it, you get layers and layers of organic matter starting to be on top, and you start to get a soil. But the lichens and the mosses really start to break down the rock, which is the parent material. So whatever you start with. So if it's granite, your parent material is granite. If it's quartzite, it's quartzite. Oxidation, remember, is rust. I just go in to show you because it's a really good, effective way of breaking rock down. And remember, as we put pollution in our air, we have acid rain, which can wear down rock as well as deforest. And the big thing we talked about when we get to caves is the fact that as water goes through and percolates through the soil and goes through, it can actually pick up minerals and deposit them in the tops of caves. So it actually can transport it. You can start to break up the rock that way as well. So now let's get into soil formation. How do we get this rock that's way down here to turn into something that plants can grow into? And that's the big question. What is soil formation? Well, we need to remember a couple things, some nitrogen cycles and some carbon cycles, because that's important too, because without it you don't have a really healthy soil. So carbon cycle, remember, is that movement of carbon through the air. We burn carbon, fossil fuels, which releases carbon, which goes into the atmosphere, which can get absorbed by trees, and carbon dioxide gets turned into is used to create oxygen, and it can also be absorbed by the water, and it can be used by aquatic plants, which then get eaten by really small material like plankton, which is eaten by a bigger something, which is eaten by a bigger fish, which is eaten by a bigger fish, and either then falls and dies and get trapped down here, or it could be eaten by something or fished, and then we consume it. And the same thing happens here. As the carbon is used by plants, animals eat them, cows eat them, or whatever else, or we have carrots, or whatever that it is you're consuming actually uses carbon, and with that we keep our carbon cycle going. So let's take a really quick look at this. Remember, again, if this is hard to hear, stop the video here in Edpuzzle and then go watch this in the set of notes. And if you can hear it, that's great.
Carbon is the basic building block of life, and these unique atoms are found everywhere on Earth. Carbon makes up the Earth's plants and animals, and carbon is also stored in the ocean, the atmosphere, and the crust of the planet. A carbon atom could spend millions of years moving through the Earth in a complex cycle. Understanding the carbon cycle and how it is changing is key to understanding Earth's changing climate. On land, plants remove carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Animals eat plants and either breathe out carbon or it moves up the food chain. When plants and animals die and decay, they transfer carbon back to the soil. Moving offshore, the ocean holds huge amounts of carbon, about 50 times the amount we find in the atmosphere.
The ocean is sometimes called a carbon sink, meaning that it absorbs or takes up carbon from the atmosphere. It takes up carbon through physical and biological processes.
At the ocean's surface, Carbon dioxide from the atmosphere dissolves into the water. Tiny marine plants called phytoplankton use this carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Phytoplankton are the base of the marine food web. After animals eat the plants, they breathe out the carbon or pass it up the food chain. Sometimes phytoplankton die, decompose, and are recycled in the surface waters. Phytoplankton can also sink to the ocean floor, carrying carbon as they descend. Over long time scales, this process has made the ocean floor the largest reservoir of carbon on the planet. Most of the ocean's nutrients are in cold, deep water. In a process called upwelling, currents bring nutrients and carbon up to the surface. Carbon can then be released as a gas back into the atmosphere, continuing the carbon cycle. By cycling huge amounts of carbon, the ocean helps regulate climate.
So when you think of climate, you don't often think of the ocean. Climate, you think of, is it going to be hotter this year? Is it going to be colder this year? But the oceans are actually a great regulator, a controller of the Earth's climate. And they even are controlling how much carbon is in the atmosphere, which can slow down how quickly climate.
Well, maybe we can finish this. I wonder what happened to the music and the words. Alright, let's try that again.
Humans have increased atmospheric carbon dioxide by more than 30% by burning fossil fuels and cutting down forests. The Earth has not experienced carbon dioxide levels this high for the past several million years. Researchers are learning that future climate change will depend on carbon levels in the land, in the atmosphere, and in the sea, and how these levels respond to human disturbance. About 1/3 of all human-generated carbon emissions has dissolved in the ocean. More than 80% of Earth's added heat is now stored in the ocean.
In the future, as the planet gets warmer, the water's going to warm up, and warm water can hold less carbon than cold water. The other thing is, on a warmer planet, some of the currents are going to slow down, and so we might not be forming as much of this cold, deep water. So
they're going on to say forming as much of that cold, deep water, and with that, as that circulation goes through, I don't know what's going on with this video,
Earth's ocean. The warmer water, weaker circulation.
Okay, so cold water, what they went on to say, can hold a lot more oxygen in it. So as it gets circulated through the oceans, and it flows north, the hot water does. That's why, like, Bergen, Norway, and England are warmer than Seattle, even though they're farther north, because the Gulf Stream takes that warm water up there. And then as it cools, it sinks into the ocean where it can absorb more oxygen. And then it flows along the ocean bottom back down by the Gulf of Mexico, actually all the way around Africa and all that. And you have upwelling of this cold, rich, oxygenated water. And it's a big conveyor current. So without that, the warm water at the equator has so much more space in between it because the water expands as it heats. And with that, the gases leach out into the atmosphere. And last time I checked, fish need oxygen to breathe, and so what happens is, if we don't have that constant replacement of the cold oxygenated water from the north upwelling into this to replace the water that's expanding and flowing northward, the fish would die out. And that's actually part of what happens when you get into El Nino years, except it's on the Pacific coast.
And new temperature gradients that result from climate change will impact marine life and ecosystems.
Well, I'm going to say that at this point, if you want to go back and watch that video and in its entirety, it's in the notes, and maybe it will do better for you than it is for me right now. There's also one other video here that's really short. It's on carbon, and
billions of years ago, our once lifeless planet was bombarded with a series of meteorites from outer space containing one of the most important building blocks of life.
This goes back a little farther than
The
NASA
carbon
did.
began to interact with the existing environment, mixing with water, land, and the atmosphere. Living organisms now inhabited the Earth's surface and its watery depths. These very organisms play a pivotal role in the carbon cycle as we know it today. In the oceans, carbon moves between the atmosphere and the ocean's surface through a process called diffusion. Aquatic plant life absorbs carbon through photosynthesis, fish and other marine life through consumption, which is then returned to the water and air through respiration. When these organisms die, carbon is decomposed and transferred to the ocean floor through a process called sedimentation.
Okay, so we're getting into the same thing that NASA went on, but it's there if you want to go back and review it before the test. It's in the notes. You don't have to watch the whole set of videos. For me, remember, you can always go back to the notes. Okay, so now let's take a look at a soil area. Okay, so let's look at this. We know that there are different things, and we're going to get into this. We've got A horizon, B horizon, C horizon, then you've got the bedrock down here. And we know things that contribute to this, as we talked about through mechanical and chemical weathering, is animals burrow, earthworms move things around, they churn up the soil, they allow water to kind of get down in here. And water, remember, is a really good conveyor of like slightly acidic or whatever it is, but also it's just a pretty good solvent in it of itself. But you put a little acid into it, and then you have these abilities for the water to get down. You can actually break up or bedrock underneath a soil layer, and you can continue to do it. But burrowing animals, ants, you get bacteria from decomposition, earthworms, fungus. Chipmunks on top will excrete urine and fecal matter. Snails and beetles can die. All of these things, as they perish, they decompose into the soil, making it more rich in nutrient. That's why, I wish I was better at it in the winter, but it's cold and I don't want to walk in my backyard when it's icy because, well, me and falling is not a great thing. But in the summer and now, I'm really good about composting everything when I'm cooking. I take all the eggshells and I take all of my vegetable product and I take it out and I have a compost pile, and it turns into beautiful black rich nutrient compost to add into my soils, and I actually improve my soil. So we're going to talk a lot about how this leaf litter up here can turn into something that will help us grow crops. So soil formation. So when rocks continuously break down by weathering, you get residual soil that is close to the parent material, unless it's transported. That's different. Transported soils are moved by wind and water and glaciers and waves. And then some people say humus, but this is humus, is decaying plant and animal material into the soil. So all of these things help create the soil, but the breaking down is the first step. So soil, the topmost layer of the Earth's surface is soil. So anything below that, you're getting into rocks. And there's some places, there's a reason why this area of the Great Plains is called the breadbasket of America, because these prairies, because burning would happen, Native Americans would come in and burn it to keep the prairie so they'd have good lines for hunting and seeing. Over generations, plus some natural weathering from the mountains, created a nice rich layer of topsoil. And we can grow a lot of things in it because we happen to have the right conditions of soil and temperature and, climate. I mean, our temperatures, as we get warmer, the problem is that moves north. The problem is the farther north you go, and like to the Canadian Shield, the glaciers have come through and scraped away all the topsoil and deposited it down here. So that's another way we got some soil layers down here. And over the last century of farming, we've lost a lot of our topsoil through wind. So that's kind of a big deal. So the topmost layer on the Earth's surface in areas that have it is going to be where you're going to find your soil, unless you're on bedrock, and most places will have some kind of material broken down. It might be sand if you're in a desert. So it's a mixture of rock, minerals, organic matter, and living things. That's the definition of soil. And there's three main components. And you've got sand, silt, and clay. And clay is teeny tiny. Silt is a little bit bigger, and sand is bigger. And this is comparing it to like a pebble size. So that's what you're going to find in here. And you start to see different types of soils. Silty soil has a lot of silt. Guess what? Guess what sandy soil has? It has a lot of sand. Clay is a lot of clay, and loam is a nice combination of these. Gardeners like loam because with that you get a lot of fertility. You want that kind of mixture. You want the clay because it allows nutrients to get in. It's pretty broken down, but you want sand to allow some drainage. I, at my house, have clay soil, which means it retains water. And once the soil is saturated, there's nowhere to go except if we have lots of rain over lots of days, except into my house. So that's why we have sump pumps. So the other thing that you're going to find in soils is bacteria, fungi, molds, worms, insects. So the living things also help break up that soil and create better soil. Worms are great decomposers. So all that variety of living things gives us a much more productive soil. So first of all, we have bedrock, and we get cracks, or we get some frost wedging, or some release of pressure, or some kind of mechanical weathering getting in here. And as that happens and we start to break down, or even at this point you get house lichens, which would have some chemical weathering because it's secreting acids and breaking it down. And eventually you get the bedrock, you get the sea horizon beginning to form, which sounds funny. Why isn't it A? Well, sea comes first because that ends up being farther down here where we're breaking up the bedrock. As the bedrock breaks up, and now you're starting to get some organic matter, some, finer minerals, that parent material is really broken down, and now you get some leaves and other things, detritus falling down, and you start to incorporate some organics, and we get our A horizon. Now, guess what B horizon is? It's a leaching of minerals and things like that through water percolating down, dragging some of this down into the sea layer here. And it's kind of that mixing. The B horizon is literally a mixing of the parent rock, sea layer, and your A layer, the organics. So this is a fully developed where we've got our organic matter, we've got our A horizon, our B horizon, our C horizon, and our bedrock. That would be a very good test question to understand those layers. And we'll go through this a number of times, so don't feel bad about it. Like right here. So bedrock, again, if you forget what I'm saying, I have it written down here in the notes. Bedrock starts to break down, and as that happens, you start to get a sea layer forming. Now we add in an A horizon, so decomposed matter starts to come into play, but we don't have a lot of mixing here yet. Once this decomposition and that organic matter start to leach into the sea layer, we get a mixing, and you get this B level layer, which is the mixture of A and C. And roots like this layer because it's starting, that can bring some stuff down too, but they can get into some good minerals that they need to grow. And once more, this is an animation of soil formation. So rain comes in and starts to form cracks, and you get freezing and thawing and frost action. You start to get the cracks forming more and more, breaking it apart into a little bit smaller chunk. And remember, the more area we have, now we've got our lichens coming in and starting to break down. Now we're getting some vegetation on top, and now you're starting to get a more full soil where you're actually getting leaf litter and decomposing animals, and you're getting beetles and worms and all of that coming in to make our soil richer. And your C horizon will mix with your A horizon to give you that B horizon, and you've got our organics on top, and that is a fully mature soil. All right, here we go. O horizon, otherwise known as organic. I'm going to read through this because if I tell you this 13 times, maybe you'll remember and have an easier time with the test. So here we go. You can see our layers here. O horizon is the top layer of organic matter made from humus and leaf litter. A horizon contains a mixture of minerals, grains from the parent rock, and organic matter of humus called topsoil. That's our topsoil layer. The B horizon then is made up of clay and only a little bit of the humus. Now I'm saying it. It's often leached red or yellow by rain as the minerals move downward, and we call this our subsoil. It's not as fertile as the topsoil. And your C horizon is partly weathered rock and pieces of gravel, so it's a broken up bedrock. And the last but not least, of course, we have our bedrock, which is the mass of rock from the parent material that we break down to. And that, by the way, bedrock is not a soil horizon. It is the bedrock. And if you look at a cross section of this as a soil profile, you can see your C horizon, that leaching of red into your B horizon as the material from here literally leaches down into this area. And then you get your organics on top. This is also another one as well. And you can see the nice rich topsoil. You can see a definite B horizon. You can see a delineation of the C horizon. And if you went down farther, you'd see some rock, more than likely. Okay, so also remember when we talked about water and movement, as water goes down here, if it hits bedrock, that's the confining layer, and you can get your water table. Now, if it's under pressure, you can have an artesian well, and if not, you just have groundwater moving along the rocks and traveling to the lowest point. It's always trying to get to the lowest point, which in most cases, if it can get there, is ultimately the ocean. So the other thing you need to understand is, remember we said that you've got silt and clay and sand. Those are the three main components of our soil. And we can use this, it looks weird because it's a triangular graph. Have you ever seen a triangular graph? Well, that means we've got clay up here, we've got sand down in this corner, we've got silt here. And this is telling us this is the percentage of silt, this is the percentage of clay, and this is the percentage of sand. And if I know it's 50% sand and maybe 20% clay, I can follow that line down until I find the 50, and I really want to use my other hand. And if with that, if I know it's, well, think of this 100%, 50 from 100 is 50 minus 20, that means I'm going to be following this up roughly to 30, and I'm going to be somewhere in this sandy clay loam, and I could read that chart. And again, you can see up here, this is just a better representation. I've got our percentages on the bottom of our silt and our clay and our sand, but this is more showing you kind of the mixing that occurs. And that's these are different representations of soils. So let's look at reading this. This one is almost 20% silt, just under 70% sand, and right about 10% clay. So that falls in this sandy loam, where this one is about 40% sand, and its clay is around 20%, which means there's 40% left for the silt, and that's a true loam. Do you see how you do this? You figure out the three different types and you use the graph and you follow them together, 3 points triangulation, to find the place where it's going to end up being. And we could do it with a few more graphs, and these are available in the notes if you want to practice. If you're more over on this side where you're at 40, 60, and only 25, you can get in that silty clay loam. So all of these things represent different parts and different types of soils. And this is types of garden soils. So if I take a quick look at this, you can see we've got clay and loam and peat, so that's organic matter, silty, sandy, saline. And over here, and I'm not going to expect you to know this for the test, but different types of soil. Light soils are sand-based or peat-based. This would be fibrous, because if you've ever worked with peat, it's big fibers of broken down material. And sand would be coarse. Feel would be gritty. Structural stability weak. You can move sand around pretty easily. If you've ever slid down a sand pile, you know that. Sand does not hold moisture well, but it drains fast. So sometimes we add a little sand in if we've got, like my soil, which is clay, and it's very easy to dig. The same with peat. It's crumbly, but it's again structurally weak. It's a fair moisture holder. It drains slowly, so sometimes a combination of those isn't bad. Medium, you're getting into silt-based, and you can see how you go through with medium, loam-based, chalk, limestone, clay-based. This is what I've got. It is hard to dig. It's slow to drain, and it's waterlogged. So clay is not always your friend, but it's what I've got, so it's what I work with. This shows you the dominant soils in Minnesota. So this is where you see mines working, so you're going to have some mine trailings. Peat is this kind of really light pink, which you see around, obviously, would that make sense that that's going to be around Minnesota with a lot of lakes, because that's where you usually get peat. This gray is basically dominant of clay and silt, which you see some down here and some along the Red River Valley. And then you get into silt and sand, which is over here and a little bit along there. Sand and gravel is kind of interspersed throughout. So if you've ever been to a gravel pit or a sand pit to get sand, they're kind of interesting to see. They're basically mining an old seabed or a really good deposition from glaciers. Silty glacial sediment. Look at the bulk of our state. See, this was actually a lot of scouring, but it deposited a lot of its glacial sediments all over the state of Minnesota and into Iowa and the Dakotas. And we can go through and we can see steep slope sediments, that would make sense because that's along river areas. Sandy glacial sediments, this is more sand versus this is a little heavier. But this is a soil graph of the state of Minnesota. I am not going to go through and watch this. It's 9 minutes long. This is actually in your section summary where I have questions for it. I leave it in here just because sometimes I actually show this in class and have you watch it at the same time, and I'm not taking it out because we're not in class, but you will do that one without me. So the other important thing for a healthy soil is the nitrogen cycle. Now, interestingly enough, nitrogen accounts for, if you remember from meteorology, 78% of our atmosphere, but most things can't take it in directly. So, but plants need nitrogen in the form of nitrates or amino acids, and they're needed for making proteins, and proteins are needed for cell growth. Do you start to see why we need this stuff? But nitrogen in the atmosphere isn't really useful to plants. So plants get it from their need from the soil. So we need to be able to fix nitrogen in the soil. And so what happens is when you have something called a legume, a bean plant is a legume, it has the unique ability to affix nitrogen nodes to its roots, and then it makes it available. So a lot of times corn is a super heavy feeder. So a lot of farmers will do crop rotation where they'll put at the end corn because it's a heavy feeder, and then the next year they might plant legumes or beans to affix the nitrogen back into the soil, and then they might do a clover or an alfalfa or something like that to put a lot of organic matter back into it, and then they do corn again. So they have different fields what they rotate through. That's how we used to do it before we had a lot of fertilizers. And remember, fertilizers are gained from oil. So without oil, we need oil not for cars right now. We really need it for our fertilizers so we can grow food. So nitrogen, remember, is required by plants to produce chlorophyll, and weed also provides rapid growth and it produces healthy leaves. And nitrogen can be fixed to the roots of legumes or beans, and it can be used by other plants. And that's a big part of the nitrogen cycle. The plant can take it, breathes it in, it fixes it to their roots, and allows other plants then to use it, which then get consumed by something and then decompose, or you release it back into the atmosphere. But the nitrogen is an important part of our cycle to make our plants grow. It makes for a healthier soil. And last but not least, and I don't really have time to show this, but if you get to the bottom set of the notes and you want, I have Bill Nye erosion, and I cannot find it to put it into Edpuzzle. And I'm not going to make you go through and answer 20 questions at the end of this because I just made you do that with the Sahara, which I'm hoping is working now. Hopefully we'll find out. But this is here if you'd like to watch it. It's not required. There are no questions with it. If you want to watch a Bill Nye and you're bored because you're stuck at home, it's at the bottom of the notes. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you had a good time, or at least as good a time as you can learning, and that's always fun for me. But if you have questions on any of the questions I'm about to ask you in the Edpuzzle, or anything in general, you know the deal. Jump on Zoom, email me, and I will get back to you just as soon as I can. Have a good day. Bye.